Good afternoon. My name is Peter Sprigg, and I'm a Senior Fellow for Policy Studies here at the Family Research Council. I want to welcome those of you joining us here at our headquarters in downtown Washington, D.C., as well as those joining us on the web. We're delighted you can be here today for this special lecture by one of our own, my colleague Arina Grossu. She is the director of the Center for Human Dignity here at Family Research Council. Her work focuses on issues involving the sanctity of human life from conception to natural death. She is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and received her MA in theology from the Dominican House of Studies and is currently pursuing a Master of Science degree in bioethics through the University of Mary. She holds a certification in healthcare ethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center and is also on the board of directors of the National Pro-Life Religious Council. Arina has appeared on numerous media outlets defending the pro-life position, as well as lecturing in a number of settings, but we're always delighted when she can do it right here at FRC. So please welcome my colleague Arina Grossu.
Thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure. This is actually one of the areas that is extremely fascinating to me, so I'm happy to share it with you. And I'll just go right into it, and it's jam-packed, so stay with me. The topic, of course, is eugenics and transhumanism in the modern age, the pursuit of biological perfection at what cost? Eugenics advocates the improvement of the human race, and this can be done either through positive eugenics, which is to promote the sexual reproduction of people with certain traits, or to reduce the sexual reproduction of other people with less desired or undesirable traits. Today, this appears more through gene editing, and we'll get into the bioethical aspects of that. I'm going to go through a little bit of the history of the eugenics movement. First of all, Thomas Malthus in the 1700s and 1800s influenced Darwin to form his theory of natural selection and population control. William Goodall advocated castration and spaying of the insane. Galton is the first to coin the term eugenics and to bring about the idea of nature versus nurture. Of course, we have Charles Darwin, who was a cousin of Galton, and he had the theory of evolution, survival of the fittest. Of course, the strong will survive and reproduce, the weak will die out, and the organisms that are better adapted are the ones who are going to survive. And this was in 1871, it was The Descent of Man, Origin of Species in 1859. So here's a quote from Descent of Man. "Thus the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care or care wrongly directed leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." Galton, saying, "The question was then forced upon me, could not the race of men be similarly improved? Could not the undesirables be rid of and the desirables multiplied?" That was in 1914. 1906, in the US, the National Heredity Commission began. It was founded by Willett Hayes, and he was the founder of the American Breeders Association. And he selected other members to be part of it, including Alexander Graham Bell. And the purpose of the commission was to investigate all the proper means of influencing heredity to better the race. It aimed to increase families of good blood and to discourage the vicious elements in the crossbred American civilization. It also wanted to study a new species of human being that could be consciously evolved. So around that time, US sterilization laws started to be enacted. So they tried to enact laws in 1897 in Michigan, but there were not enough votes. In 1905, they tried in Pennsylvania as well, and it was vetoed by the governor. But in 1907, it was first enacted in Indiana. It became the first state to have a sterilization program. In 1909, California became the third state, following Washington and Connecticut. And actually, California is significant because it is the state where most sterilizations happened in the US. So before World War II, nearly half of the coercive sterilizations were done in California. And even after the war, the state accounted for a third. So California performed about 20,000 sterilizations, or 1/3 of the 60,000 that were performed in America during this time. So for example, this was just from the first International Eugenics Congress in 1912, a list of all the states. And actually, you see the state's motive, purely eugenics, on the side. It says who were the persons. So these were the persons who were that were directed at them. And here's some information about Indiana, which was, of course, the first. And it was for the insane, feeble-minded, epileptic. The Eugenics Record Office opened in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. It is still the center for finding out information about American eugenics. And it was from 1910 to 1939. It was financed by the Rockefeller family and the Carnegie Institution. And Charles Davenport established it along with Harry Laughlin. And of course, both men were members of the American Breeders Association. And of course, they again wanted to breed the strongest of humans while to improve the human race, while discouraging that other humans reproduce. Major players in the eugenics movement: Carnegie, Rockefeller, the Harriman Railroad fortune, and scientists from all the major Ivy Leagues. These are just some of the people involved. These are the types of things you would see coming out of the record office, pedigrees. People were very interested in finding out if they were normal or if they were one of the feeble-minded. So they would make these charts showing the normal line, the degenerate line, registering human pedigrees. This was from 1913, New York Times. Nearly 15 million school children are defectives. The clearinghouse for mental defectives. And here you can actually see the pie chart dividing what kind of defectives. Are they feeble-minded, not feeble-minded? Are they imbeciles, morons, idiots, physically defective? This is the New York Times. The book Civic Biology was published in 1914. This became the major biology books that was used in public schools during this time. And actually, it was the Scopes monkey trial is also based on information in this biology book. But these are quotes from the book itself. Tuberculosis, syphilis, that dread disease which cripples and kills hundreds of thousands of innocent children, epilepsy, feeble-mindedness, are handicaps which is not only unfair but criminal to hand down to posterity. The science of being well born is called eugenics. So this is what school children were being taught. And essentially the second paragraph talks about how these types of people are parasites on society. They take from society and give nothing in return. They are true parasites. So what's the remedy? If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. So, in Europe, in London in 1912, as I said before, was the first International Eugenics Congress. And this was a venue for scientists, politicians, leaders, who all came together. This is the elite of the world coming together to talk about eugenics, to improve human heredity based on all of those ideas that Darwin and Galton and others had. So the first Congress was dedicated to Galton, who died the year before, so he never made it to it, but Darwin's son presided. The second one was held in New York in 1921. And this was from, again, the New York Times, 1921. Want more babies in best families. Major Darwin sees it patriotic duty of better classes to increase their offspring. Limitation also needed. And at this Congress, there was a report given of American sterilization laws and the best method to cut off defective germplasm. And in the final address, Major Darwin, again, shared why eugenics is the practical application of the principle of evolution. The third one was also New York in 1932, and that was the last one. The American Eugenics Society also started here in 1922, just about the time right after the International Eugenics Conference. And this was a result of the conference. So it was formed after the success of the International Conference. Grant, Laughlin, Fisher, Osborne, and others were involved in this. And its mission was to promote racial betterment, eugenic health, and genetic education through public lectures, exhibits, at county fairs, etc. So here you go. These are some of the propaganda posters of the American Eugenics Society. Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. Live, love, and marry wisely. The result is sound children. Release the stranglehold of hereditary disease and unfitness. So, of course, increase the high-grade people to reproduce at a greater rate for the benefit of society. How long are we Americans to be so careful for the pedigree of our pigs and chickens and cattle and then leave the ancestry of our children to chance or to blind sentiment? So they went to various fairs all around the country to sell the eugenic ideas. So here's Kansas Free Fair 1929 in the 20s. People would hear about all these eugenic ideas. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest. Then they had fitter family contests. People would bring their families and they would be judged to see how fit they were. So this was, they were the winners of a medium family class. And there were the winners of another fitter family contest. And this is the history of America. How many of you have learned this in your history books? Raise your hands. I know, I was shocked. And all of these photos are available at the Cold Spring Harbor. They have a website, thousands upon thousands of these photos. Fitter Family Headquarters in Savannah, 1924. I was just surprised that this lady won. She had glasses. Isn't there something wrong with that? Doesn't seem fit to me. Then they had better baby contests, too. So here's a 1908 State Fair baby contest. 1931 State Fair, everyone's preparing their babies to be examined. So it's no surprise, 1921, just about the time that the Second International Congress was hosted in New York, the American Birth Control League started in 1921. It's also called Planned Parenthood, and it didn't change its name until 1942. Margaret Sanger was a big eugenicist. So it was founded by her in New York City, same year, and she was the leader of the American birth control movement. She saw the birth control as a means to prevent unwanted children from being born. And she wanted to discourage the reproduction of people who it was believed would pass on mental disease or serious physical defect. She advocated sterilization in cases where the subject was unable to use birth control. So she started the Birth Control Review, which was a journal of the American Birth Control League. Birth Control for Better Stock and Better Living. And that was from 1929. So some of her quotes. Sterilization of the insane and feeble-minded and the encouragement of this operation upon those afflicted with inherited or transmissible diseases with the understanding that sterilization does not deprive the individual of his or her sex expression, but merely renders him incapable of producing children. 1922. Birth control must lead ultimately to a cleaner race. 1922 again. Feeble-mindedness perpetuates itself from the ranks of those who are blandly indifferent to their racial responsibilities. You have a racial responsibility to not reproduce if you're unfit. And it is largely this type of humanity we are now drawing upon to populate our world for the generations to come. If civilization is to survive, we must extirpate by the very roots. Again, eugenics was, if you go back through all her journals, she has eugenics throughout. 1932, give dysgenic groups, people with bad genes, in our population their choice of segregation or compulsory sterilization. 1932 again, we should apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted or whose inheritance is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. Then they created a code for babies. So Article 1 is, American Baby Code shall be to provide for better distribution of babies and to protect society against the propagation and increase of the unfit. 1924, Virginia became the first state to pass the Sterilization Act. So this was compulsory sterilization of the intellectually disabled for the purpose of eugenics. So they were forcibly sterilized. So Carrie Buck's case worked its way to the US Supreme Court. She and her guardian contended that the Due Process Clause guarantees all adults the right to procreate, a right which was being violated. And she also made the argument under the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment that not all similarly situated people were being treated the same, and that this was only applied for the feeble-minded at certain state institutions, and made no mention of other state institutions or other institutions. So 3 years later, this came before the U.S. Supreme Court, Buck versus Bell, 1927, and in an 8-1 decision, compulsory sterilization was legalized throughout the U.S. So, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, this is a famous line he said, which you may have heard before, or not. Carrie Buck is the probable potential parent of socially inadequate offspring, likewise afflicted, that she may be sexually sterilized without detriment to her general health, and that her welfare and that of society will be promoted by her sterilization. So society is better off if Carrie Buck is sterilized. This was one of the justices. We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices. So being sterilized against your will is a lesser sacrifice, often not felt to be such by those concerned. So she doesn't even realize this. To prevent our being swamped with incompetence, it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. So let's kill people because who knows if they're going to become criminals. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. So he's likening getting a vaccine with being forcibly sterilized. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This was in the Supreme Court ruling. You can go online and read it. Oddly enough, not only was Carrie Buck not an imbecile, quote unquote, but the reason he said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough is because Carrie actually was raped and had a child that she kept. And this child was very smart. In fact, she was at the top of her class, completely flying in the face of all of this. Her child died later because of some illness, but you could see that it was an ideology that was imposed because of the tradition. The Nazis at the Nuremberg trials quoted Holmes' words in their own defense to no avail. So 60,000 Americans were sterilized. And this is just a map of the laws as they went into effect. And so was there any pushback? Well, in 1930, this was 3 years after the Supreme Court decision, Pope Pius XI said, "Public magistrates have no direct power over the bodies of their subjects. Therefore, where no crime has taken place and there is no cause present for grave punishment, they can never directly harm or tamper with the integrity of the body, either for the reasons of eugenics or for any other reason." I'm going to go through this quickly because we have a lot to cover still. Obviously, the eugenics movement had an impact on Nazi Germany. Adolf, in his book, in his own autobiography, said, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of citizenship are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States." This was in 1925, 2 years before America passed compulsory sterilization. And then in 1933, it deployed its own sterilization laws, and might I say, he used the model, the American legal model for it. Again, one of his advisors quoted Adolf Hitler saying, "I have studied with great interest the laws of several American states concerning prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would, in all probability, be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock." And of course, they actually looked very much toward California, the Germans did. And people in California who were involved in the eugenics movement gave them a lot of pamphlets and sheets. And Germany sterilizations, they were accelerating beyond 5,000 per month by 1934. And the California eugenics leader, C.M. Guth, upon returning from Germany, bragged, "You'll be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epoch-making program. Everywhere I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people." In 1934, Joseph Desjarnette, who was the superintendent of Virginia's Western State Hospital, said to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, "The Germans are beating us at our own game." And Leon Whitney, who was the executive secretary of the American Eugenics Society, speaking of Nazism, said, "While we were pussyfooting around, the Germans were calling a spade a spade." Harry Laughlin is the one, not only was he the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office, but he drafted the model legislation that I mentioned earlier, which was used not only to influence the national legislation on forced sterilization. He bragged that his laws had been implemented in the 1935 Nuremberg racial hygiene laws. He was invited to attend an award ceremony for him in Heidelberg University in Germany in 1936, and it was scheduled on the anniversary of Hitler's 1934 purge of the Jews from the Heidelberg faculty. And so he was going to receive an honorary doctorate for his work on the science of racial cleansing. He couldn't make it, but it was shipped to the Rockefeller Institute, so he picked it up from the Rockefeller Institute. Just a little note about eugenics and euthanasia. Not all eugenicists were also pro-euthanasia, but some were. So in 1912, the Carnegie-supported report, there was a report called Preliminary Report on the Committee of the Eugenics Section of the American Breeders Association to study and to report on the best practical means for cutting off the defective germplasm in the human population. This was at the Second Eugenics Congress in New York. It suggested point number 8, which was euthanasia. So one of the suggestions was lethal chamber or public locally operated gas chambers. America was not ready for a large-scale euthanasia program. In 1918, this was Pope Note, the Army venereal disease specialist during World War I, co-wrote Applied Eugenics, which argued, from an historical point of view, the first method which presents itself is execution, Its value in keeping up the standard of the race should not be underestimated. They also had a chapter called Lethal Selection, which operated through the destruction of the individual. So, since you can't outright kill them, why don't you just create factors that are going to bring on their death? Excessive cold, bacteria, or bodily deficiency. So they would introduce these to kill them without actually killing them directly. So this was an indirect way. Many doctors found clever ways of implementing eugenic euthanasia. And some of these is that, for example, at a mental institution in Lincoln, Illinois, they fed their patients milk infected with tuberculosis to kill them, resulting in 30 to 40% annual death rates. So it was a lethal neglect and causing death by different means. There was a lot of propaganda for euthanasia in 1930s, portrayals of eugenic mercy killings. 1931, the Illinois Homeopathic Medicine Association started to lobby for the right to euthanize imbeciles, quote unquote. And in 1938, the Euthanasia Society of America was founded. It's still trying to this day, and obviously it's had some success. Now 4 states legalized assisted suicide. But for our purposes, forced segregation and sterilization programs were the major way that this eugenic mindset was implemented in America, not euthanasia. So Germany took it one step further. So now we're going to go straight into the Newgenics and transhumanism. So transhumanism, human plus, is an international cultural and intellectual movement with an eventual goal of fundamentally transforming the human condition by developing and making widely available technologies to greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. Now, not all science and technology is bad. It's not. It's good. It depends how we use it. Here, actually, you could see some of the eugenic mindset. I wanted to show you how it's developed over time. So Dr. Robert Edwards is an embryologist. He was speaking at an annual meeting of the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology. Soon it will be a sin for parents to have a child that carries the heavy burden of genetic disease. We are entering a world where we have to consider the quality of our children. 1999. He also was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine for the development of IVF. Many of you are familiar with Professor Peter Singer at Princeton University. He is the professor of bioethics there, in fact. And he said in 1979, human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons, therefore the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. He also believed in infanticide, that a newborn in the first 30 days could be killed, so outside the womb is currently legally protected under law. And he believed that some physicians should kill some disabled babies, and that babies could be killed in the first 30 days after birth. And that the lives of people in persistent vegetative state are not worth living. So this is a subset of people who we can discard, according to him. In the experimentation of humans who are not self-aware, if you could really confidently determine that this person will never recover consciousness, it's a lot better to use them than the chimp. So a person in persistent vegetative state should be experimented on before a chimp, instead of a chimp. Here's another Nobel laureate, James Watson. No one might have the guts to say this, but if we could make better human beings by knowing how to add genes, why shouldn't we? That was in 2001. If we don't play God, who will? So let's look at some of the screenings that are available today. So you have diagnostic screenings. You have carrier screenings. So diagnostic screenings to see if you actually have a disease. Carrier screening, if you're a carrier of a disease, even if you don't actually have it. Newborn screening, a screening of a newborn. Prenatal screening, this is a screening of an unborn child. And PGD, which is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, this is the screening of a little embryo that was created via IVF. So you can test for disease traits if you're a carrier, so for the actual disease, if you're a carrier, if you are predisposed to something, or non-disease traits, any kind of traits. So the question to keep in mind is, screening is not necessarily bad, and we'll go into some screening that is good, but the question to keep in mind is, to what end are we doing this screening for? Is it to heal, or is it to kill and destroy? So that's what we have to keep in mind. Some of the concerns are people given enough informed consent? Is there a confidentiality? So you have your genetic material in some lab document record. Is that safe? Is someone going to use it against you at some point? Employment and insurance discrimination. If you're getting screened and you're predisposed or you're a carrier or something, are you going to lose insurance opportunities because of that genetic condition or predisposition that you might have? Being stigmatized, and eugenics. So in 2007, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they revised the recommendations. At first, there were only some women who were at risk of having children with some kind of abnormality that should get screened in the first trimester. But they changed it that all pregnant women, no matter if they're at risk, should get screened. So the question is, why? How is that information going to be used? And are they going to push for abortion? And as you may guess, a lot of times, and especially since screening is being pushed for everybody, these doctors are pushing for abortion. So this is just a chart to show so from 1993 to 2016, the number of labs is the red line. The number of labs hasn't changed too much. The green line is the number of diseases that they're able to screen for. So it went from near 100 in 1993 to about 4,500 in 2016. So now they can screen you for about 4,500 different diseases. How are they going to use this information? You can also you can have a at-home kit. You can actually just send in a saliva sample for $199 and includes access to the DNA ancestry, and you can receive 65 plus personalized genetic reports. This is good if you're interested in it, but this information, how are they going to guard your genetic information from others? Something to ponder. Again, there are microarrays and gene chips that can detect your DNA and to do a genomic analysis of your own DNA. So we've come a long way, technology-wise. So science and technology are good. They are good, except when they kill human beings or compromise human dignity. So we have the power to use this science to heal and to do good things with it. But we have to remember the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. That's the first rule of medicine. So let's go right into it. These are some of the ways that they can do the screening. So the chorionic villus sampling, they actually take a little bit of the chorionic villi from the side of the uterus, and they test the cells, usually done between 10 and 12 weeks. There's a risk of miscarriage, 1 in 100. So if you're asking a woman and you're suggesting to a woman to do this kind of screening, she has a risk of miscarriage, and how is she going to use that information? But further, is that going to be helpful? If it's a condition that can be operated on eventually in the womb, that's helpful. But if it's meant to just not to try to encourage a woman to have an abortion if a condition comes up, then obviously it's not. It's not defending of human dignity. There's also amniocentesis. You're taking some amniotic fluid from the cavity and looking at those cells for a chromosome analysis. is done a little bit later in pregnancy, 15 to 18 weeks. And the risk of miscarriage runs from 1 in 200 to 1 in 400. Again, there's a risk of miscarriage. You can also determine the sex of your baby as early as 6 weeks by doing some blood tests, non-invasive tests, or you can get an at-home kit again, starting at 9 weeks. So here we have a way that people can have sex-selective abortion. So either you do it at home, you check out the test, or you go in. What do you do with that information? Why do people want to know? Some want to know because they want to prepare for a boy or a girl, but others can use this and have used this to abort a child because he's not a girl or she's not a boy. And if we think that this is only happening in India and China, that's not the case. We don't have numbers of how many are happening here in the US. We do know that there's about 160 million abortions based on sex selection internationally. And Lila Rose from Live Action did an undercover sting. You can go to liveaction.org/gendercide and she went into American Planned Parenthoods to see if they do sex-selective abortion. So you can watch those videos. There's also race-selective abortions. Live Action did an entire undercover sting on this. And they called to find out if Planned Parenthoods would receive money for the abortion of a black baby. And they did. And so you can watch that video too. Also, just the way that Margaret Sanger wanted it, 79% of Planned Parenthood's surgical abortion facilities are within walking distance of African American or Hispanic Latino neighborhoods, according to the 2010 U.S. Census data. Live Action also revealed that, like I said, they accept money for aborting black babies. And although black women make up only 13% of the female population, they undergo approximately 28% of all the abortions in the U.S. And black children are aborted at nearly 4 times the rate of white children. 1 in 3 black babies are killed in the womb. And here was a piece from 2014. More African American babies aborted in New York City than born. So is eugenics still happening? Now, looking at some more of the screening. So we have Down syndrome screening, first trimester, second trimester. They have new prenatal tests for doing it. So how many Down syndrome babies are aborted? Between 60 and 90%. There was a systematic review of this. The older data was said 90%. I think once they looked at a lot of different studies, so it ranges from 60 to 90. Receiving initial Down syndrome diagnosis. What were the parents' experiences of receiving this diagnosis? 1 in 4 women report that they felt pressured to have an abortion after their physicians delivered a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome. Is eugenics still happening in the U.S.? Trisomy 18 and 13 screenings. Again, that's one of the 4,500 diseases you can screen for. You can do it in the first trimester. 78% are aborted with trisomy 13, 18, and triploidy. Cystic fibrosis. A Kaiser study found 91% of children with cystic fibrosis diagnosis were aborted. What about Zika? That's the hot topic right now. So do we kill a class of children because of their special needs? How is this different from America in the 1920s, 30s that forcibly caused damage against people because of their condition or someone's interpretation of it? So what we have right now, the most current stats are that there are 13 live-born infants with birth defects and another 7 pregnancy losses with birth defects out of the nearly 4 million U.S. births annually. So the entire Zika virus scare, we know it's based in Miami, but that's been 13 children that have been born with birth defects out of the 4 million. So I think they're blowing it way out of proportion. We need to focus on finding on preventing microcephaly because of Zika, but we need to take this into account. Also, microcephaly is not a common condition. This is from the CDC. State birth defects tracking systems say that microcephaly ranges from 2 babies per 10,000 live births to about 12 babies per 10,000 live births. New York Times just recently published this, saying at least 10% have no mental deficits at all. So one, even if a woman was exposed, does not mean that her child actually will have microcephaly. And then 10% had no and people who are diagnosed with microcephaly, 10% still had no mental deficits at all. Others were highly functional, even though they had intellectual disabilities. Others were profoundly disabled. Meanwhile, our friend Planned Parenthood, that was around since the 20s and by a different name, is going door to door to promote abortion. Because why should we have children with microcephaly? That would be against the eugenic mindset. And this was just from 2 days ago, that article. But even if children are born with microcephaly, so what? We had the pleasure of having Brendan Buell representing Jackson and Brittany Buell. Jackson was born with microhydrocephaly, and he has 1/5 of his brain. If you go online under Jackson Strong on Facebook, you can see all his videos where he's saying, "I love you." I have no idea what part of his brain he's using. The fact that he's starting to crawl around, that's impossible by medical terms. His family, the doctors would call every week after they found out that he was going to have this, asking them to abort Jackson, and they refused to. Now, there's an entire medical community in Boston that studies Jackson's condition because he's a medical marvel. So the dichotomy, let's abort if we have some kind of diagnosis, but hey, let's celebrate human life when they beat all odds. Again, here's a mom who is raising 2 children born with microcephaly, and these are more extreme cases of microcephaly. For women who are afraid or may actually be pregnant with a child who has microcephaly and who don't feel equipped to raise that child, there are a lot of support groups. First of all, going to the Foundation for Children with Microcephaly, there are a lot of people there. And then there are a lot of adoption networks for children specifically with disabilities. There are families who want to adopt children with disabilities, and those are just some of them. Adopt America Network, adoptspecialneeds.org, afamilyforeverychild.org, Special Angels Adoption, etc., etc. So some states wisened up and started to put bans on abortions, on the abortions of babies who have some kind of genetic condition. So North Dakota passed it, Indiana. This is the most up-to-date information from Guttmacher Institute, August 1st. And so there are 7 states that have bans on sex-selective abortions, 1 on race-selective, and 2 on genetic anomalies. But in those other states, there are actually 7. Some are enjoined temporarily or permanently. So those states moved it all the way, and it passed. It's just enjoined. So there are actually states doing something about it. And 3 states require counseling on perinatal hospice for a woman who may undergo an abortion because of a lethal fetal condition. Kansas requires counseling before any abortion performed. So what can doctors do? 1, not push for screening and testing. What's the purpose? If the mom or the dad have some kind of genetic condition and they want to find out so they can better prepare if their child does have that condition, that's a good use of screening, but they should give information to the patients about the risks of miscarriage. Is it worthwhile to find if that child is carrying a condition while risking that child's life? Inform parents of the inaccuracies of screening and the risks of testing. So there's screening and there's testing. And some of these just say your child may have X amount % chance of having this, and they will take that as that the child actually has that disease or condition when the child actually doesn't. And then offer information about support groups, especially for first-time parents. If they're already scared, it's their first time being a parent, and then they get some kind of diagnosis, they feel alone. Doctors need to do a better job of telling patients about the fact that there are support groups out there for them. So one study discusses the disparity between physicians' and patients' attitudes towards abortion, suggesting that professionals are more prone to suggest abortion post-diagnosis before the parents even would consider it. So the doctor's already saying, well, you can abort, without giving them other options. How is that choice? How is that informed consent? One study found most abortions because of fetal abnormality occurred within 72 hours of the woman receiving the test results. So in 3 days, did she have time to research support groups, what she can do for herself and her baby? Did she go for a second opinion? This was a study that showed that it resulted in less test use and more informed choices. When women were told of the risks of doing these screenings, a lot of them opted out of doing the screenings to begin with. So less test use and more informed choices. Fewer women underwent this testing because they were given more information about the risks. So here are just some quick resources. Reese's Rainbow, sponsor a family or donate to a waiting child for families with Down syndrome diagnoses. There are so many. This is for trisomy 18 and 13. You have SOFT, Be Not Afraid, National Down Syndrome Adoption Network, Trisomy 18 Foundation, Every Child's Life, no matter how fragile, forever changes our world. Isaiah's Promise, support for families carrying to term after severe or fatal prenatal diagnosis. National Center for Prenatal and Postnatal Resources, String of Pearls. These are just some of the support networks out there. What can we do? We can encourage our family and friends to become informed about the inaccuracies and risks of screening and testing. Offer any kind of help, whether it's emotional, financial, spiritual, for someone who has received a diagnosis like this. Become informed about the support groups. Donate and volunteer with some of the support groups. Maybe consider adopting or foster parenting. If we're the pro-life generation, then I think we should encourage people and look into our own hearts to see if we can adopt, if we can foster parent, and help to pass bans against abortion because of a genetic difference. There's also eugenics happening at the cellular level, and I want to talk about this. With IVF, for example, a number of eggs are fertilized, so you have human babies, embryos. So this is from an actual clinic, Oregon Reproductive Medicine, on day 3, day 5. What they do is they grade the embryos. So grade 1 embryo, grade 5. Essentially, a technician is deciding which embryos they're going to implant depending on how they look. So right there on the bottom, it actually, with the red marks, it says best embryo. Those 2 would be implanted. The rest would be frozen indefinitely. And so eugenics is happening at the cellular level, especially with these new human beings. So how does pre-implantation genetic diagnosis work? Well, they actually take one cell of the baby, so an eighth of the baby, and they screen it. So what kind of effect does it have on a baby losing 1/8 of its body at that point? So here you see them actually pulling the cell off the baby. So it's used prior to implantation. So here you could see they biopsy the cells. Those 3 in red are all affected, meaning that baby has some kind of genetic condition. So the ones that are green don't have the genetic condition. So those will be the ones that are implanted. So I call this Any Fertility Clinic USA because this is happening everywhere. It's really bad in California. The fertility clinics in California are one of the worst. But you could see how they advertise to their clients. We assign a grade to each based on visual appearance as they develop. Top-graded embryos are selected for transfer back into the uterus to maximize the chances of a successful outcome. Our goal is for you to deliver a single healthy baby. Essentially, they kill off multiple pregnancies unless the woman wants 2 or 3 children. They implant anywhere from 1 to 3 at a time, and then they'll say, well, let's see which one is doing best. Let's see, and then they kill the other 2 or the other 1. In some cases, we can reduce the total number of embryos we transfer. Well, how do you think they're going to reduce them? They abort them. Many couples are using pre-implantation genetic screening for chromosomes to ensure that the embryos being transferred are chromosomally normal. Eugenics today. So that's selective reduction. But the CDC does not keep track of how many babies are killed because of selective reduction. In fact, this is what they say. CDC does not collect information on multifetal pregnancy reductions. Why not? So we have genetically modified foods, and some people say, I don't want anything genetically modified because of the susceptibility, the plant disease, cross-pollination. How does this affect the ecological balance? What about genetically modified animals? We have glow fish, a glow cat, and a glow monkey. These animals were given the jellyfish gene inserted for green fluorescence, and they exist. So what about genetically modified humans? Well, that's happening. So there are 2 different kinds of genetic modification. One is somatic, and the other is germline. Somatic is when they make the modification to that one individual person. Germline means you're altering or replacing the gene, the gamete, so the sperm or the egg, in the embryo, so it'll affect the entire line of anyone that person reproduces with, which means it changes the entire character of the whole human race, eventually. So the uses are therapeutic, preventive, or enhancement. So you have gene therapy versus enhancement. Therapy seeks to return a patient to normal health, respects the patient's dignity, seeks to treat or cure a disease. Enhancement is, I want to be a better athlete, I want a better IQ, I want to enhance what I already have. So there's a difference between that. So gene therapy has been used to heal, so this is a good use of science. Heal children from cancer. This was just in the New York Times. But also, we actually don't know what we're doing because gene therapy has also led to deaths. Child killed was found to have leukemia from some of these therapies, so we don't really know what we're doing yet. And of course, I want to give a plug for how adult stem cells save lives. So adult stem cells have successfully treated 73 types of diseases. Meanwhile, embryonic stem cells, which are the unethical ones, 0 types of diseases. We celebrate people, Down syndrome people, who are active members in our society. There have also made technology advancements where they can actually silence the Down syndrome gene, which some people may want to, some people may not, because they love their family members just as they are. So here's gene enhancement for better athletes. Do we want 20/20 vision, high IQ? So 3-parent embryos. This is engineering at the germline level, which means it gets passed on to anyone that person reproduces with. And so UK, it went into effect in October 2015. Our own panel is backing it up. So that's some information. So there are 4 types of techniques. And essentially, the first 2 types, I'm not going to go into describing them, but they genetically combine 2 eggs. So the egg from one woman and the egg from another woman, they combine them, and then they fertilize it with a guy's sperm. So it's 3-parent embryo with DNA from 3 people. The second one is, the third and the fourth types are even more problematic because they're GMO, they're cloned, and they're 3-parent. So instead of genetically combining 2 eggs, they fertilize the eggs, so you have embryos, and then they mash them together, kind of like Frankenstein. So you're killing an embryo to make another one. So this is the third and the fourth type are killing embryos and recombining them with the DNA from 3 people. This is also problematic. New studies are coming out showing that even though they're trying to avoid having the mitochondrial disease, this is the reason they're doing it, 2% of the of the disease still carries on even with these techniques. So it's actually not working. The disease is still present, but they're killing people and cloning people in the process. This was my paper if you wanted to get it online on 3-parent embryos. There are other ways we could do it. We could use science ethically. So possibilities include transfer of mitochondria from donor adult stem cells, removal of them via different technologies like genome editing, and et cetera. So there are ways we could do this without having to kill children in the process or use 3 parents. These are other gene editing techniques. And the newest thing that you probably have heard about are the human-animal chimeras. The NIH wants to lift the ban on these. So you're going to have human cells in animals. This happened August 4th. They wanted to lift the moratorium on the funding, on the taxpayer funding. And we could end up with an animal that has a human brain, or we can end up with an animal carrying human eggs and human sperm, which means that when they reproduce, those will be part human, part animal. And they also lifted the 14-day limit. At first they said, well, we won't let them develop more than 14 days. We'll kill them after. They don't actually use those words, but that's what they mean. Now they lifted that limit, so why don't we just let them develop? Let's see what happens. So we have until September 6th to send in public comments on this policy. The UK was way ahead, 2007. They already started doing this. Here's some more information. Mice produced human sperm to raise hope for infertile men. So human sperm being made in mice. So with human-animal chimeras, we're opening a Pandora's box without knowing the consequences. Why are we doing this? Why can't we find an ethical way to bring treatments? NIH should be more focused on treating humans than creating human-animal hybrids. Congress should ban and weigh in on such research. We're using taxpayer funds, so you guys are paying for this, by the way. It devalues human life, and it introduces a host of ethical problems. So what's the motivation? A lot of it is that scientists just want to play with science. So here's just some quotes from a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, Paul Berg. A successful experiment can produce a high that is better than any drug. The consequences of human germline, genetic engineering and enhancement, it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. We have no idea what's going to happen once we introduce these types of genetically modified cells into the human body. It is passed on to future generations with unknown consequences, creates a genetic caste system, welcome Gattaca, Brave New World, treats people as manufactured commodities. The human being becomes the property of another who is more genetically advanced, and it degrades human dignity and individuality. So let's bring in the Judeo-Christian ethic. Human beings are unique and hold a special place in creation. We're different from animals because of our capacity for reason and will. Human life is sacred. Human beings must have rights as people from the moment of conception until natural death. This was basically a suggestion from the Pontifical Council for Pastoral Assistance saying technologies that are therapeutic, that are meant to treat disease, those are good, but those that are meant for enhancement are unethical. The ERLC also put out the same kind of statements. Gene therapy for treating disease is good. Gene enhancement, not good. So these are attacks on human life. Pope Emeritus Benedict said, a new wave of discriminatory eugenics finds consensus in the name of the presumed well-being of the individual. And if you look up higher, the attacks on the right to life throughout the world have broadened and multiplied, assuming new forms, talking about the new technologies. The interest in more refined biotechnological research is growing in the more developed countries in order to establish subtle and extensive eugenic methods. This was in 2007, he said this. Even to obsessive research for the perfect child with the spread of artificial procreation and various forms of diagnosis tending to ensure good selection. Again, he also said that attempts to influence chromosomic or genetic inheritance are not therapeutic but are aimed at producing human beings selected according to sex or other predetermined qualities. These manipulations are contrary to the personal dignity of the human being and his or her integrity and identity. Therefore, in no way can they be justified on the grounds of possible beneficial consequences for future humanity. Every person must be respected for himself. In this consists the dignity and the right of every human being from his or her beginning. I'm going to end with this. There are foundational errors and truths. When you have a bad foundation, everything topples. So some of the foundational errors are that some human lives are not worth living. Suffering is the ultimate enemy. Freedom from disease or disability equals happiness. And the opposite, the truths are, all human lives are worth living and each has a right to life, from conception until natural death. Disrespect for human life is the ultimate enemy, not suffering. Suffering, when it cannot be avoided, can be an opportunity for strength, grace, sacrifice, and a reminder of the limits of human nature. We're limited beings. We have to accept this. We're all going to die someday. While optimal health is preferred, happiness does not consist in it alone. There are a lot of people with Down syndrome. Actually, they say that 99% say that they're happy. How many people with optimal health say the same thing? So what can we do? We can respect the dignity of every human life, treat people as gifts, not commodities. Don't separate marriage from sex, from procreation. Educate ourselves, our families, our neighbors, and our friends, and pass stricter laws that defend the dignity of human life. Thank you so much. I'll take some questions right now.
Please, we have a microphone here, so wait for the microphone so that people who are watching on.
Is it on? Hi, I'm Shay Garrison. This was fascinating. I had no idea of our history in America with eugenics, so this was something I really needed to hear, and I appreciate it. I wanted to ask you, going all the way back to the beginning, how was it defined? Do you know how it was defined or determined that people were feeble-minded or defective or insane, or were they just focusing on mental institutions?
Thank you for your question. They already considered people who are in the prison system, people who are homeless on the streets. If someone had a disability, they were already considered unfit. And those who ended up in mental institutions and other places like that. So it was by those effects that they judged that those people were unfit to reproduce.
Determined by local authorities?
Right. And then as these laws passed, the local authorities would judge. So actually, in America, we had sterilization camps. So in Germany, they had extermination camps. Like I said, we didn't go that far. But there were actually people were put in camps if they didn't want to be sterilized or if they did not cooperate.
Hi, Penny Starr with CNS News. Very, very enlightening. But mine brings us to the present, because the takeaway I have is that eugenics is still going on. So can you just expand on that a little bit, just kind of consolidate and how that's happening? You said the cellular level. Can you just kind of expand on that? Thank you.
So eugenics is still going on in, for example, as I showed with IVF, how some embryos are selected over others. The fact that with the prenatal screenings and diagnoses, they're done a lot of times to eliminate children with any kind of genetic conditions. So whether it's Down syndrome or trisomy 13, 18, triploidy, any of those, these screenings are done most often because they want to abort those children. So let's do away with a certain population that is quote unquote unfit to be brought into life. So in that way, it's also done. Questions?
Todd Wiggins, it was a great presentation, and I appreciate the ideals, but I would say to some degree that all of us still discriminate and by association, which is just something that you do partially to protect yourself, right? Because there are certain people that could be considered predatory, if you think of it that way, that you would not want to necessarily spend as much time with as someone that you feel could be constructive in their lifestyle. So where do you draw the line? Is there a line? I think what you're advocating is, number one, obviously no experimentation or testing of human embryos. I understand that. but where do we, number one, have enough resources in society to care for the various issues that will come with certain newborns? Do we have enough caregivers, do you feel? And number two, is the prison system taking care of the situation where people clearly stray over the boundaries of what we consider acceptable behavior in society?
Thank you for your question. There are no unwanted children. Obviously, some children with certain conditions have a difficult journey ahead, especially with the medical care they will need. But like I pointed out, there are a lot of organizations that facilitate adoptive parents meeting these children, and these parents feel a call to adopt children with special needs. And I do think societally we have to change a lot. The way, like you mentioned, the prison systems, I think those need to be improved. Speaking of prison systems, in California, even in the 2010, they were still doing some sterilizations without informed consent on women there. So that's something that's continued. So I think that better education is needed about, one, as I mentioned, for parents who are facing a diagnosis like this. One, is it accurate? And two, are they being given the information and the support system that they need? And from those studies, they show that no, many times they are not given the support that they need. And then three is to respect people who have disabilities. Isn't it ironic that we give them, we have handicap spots in our parking lot, so we're giving them, as we should, the prime of place once they're born. Well, you get the first seat, you get the first parking spot, but if they're unborn, we kill them. So there's this dichotomy and in our thinking about how we treat people with disabilities. In some countries, they're completely eliminating, for example, in England and other countries, I don't think you will see a child with Down syndrome, and that's not because they've found a way to fix Down syndrome, even though now we have the gene muting capabilities, but because they're aborting them. So we have to see how we can be pro-life in how we treat people with disabilities, the born and the unborn.
Hi, Evan Wilt from World Magazine. I wanted to talk a little bit more about something you spoke to at the end with the human-animal chimeras. What other information do you have about that? Like, how extensive is this research? And I remember you mentioned a September 6th deadline with NIH. What happens after that deadline? And can you just expand more on that topic?
So they're accepting public comments until September 6th. My hunch is that they're going to go ahead and allow this to happen and have it be funded by taxpayers. It's almost like a formality. They want to hear from people, but with a lot of cases where it's open to public comment, it doesn't actually mean that they're going to do anything. Before this time, it was that private companies could do this type of research, but now we're seeing an expansion of it, that they're saying, oh, we will publicly fund you for this research. So you can imagine how much more they're going to go into doing, and especially with no limits. And one thing I didn't mention is that the fertility industry and all of these experiments and the scientific community, they really have very little legislation to stop them from doing this. So, for example, I didn't mention this, but with the fertility industry, there's an IVF clinic in California that will actually procure procure sperm and eggs from a bank and create embryos and essentially give you a third trial type situation where people want to come in and don't necessarily want genetically related children to themselves. They will actually create batches of children from various combinations of sperm and eggs and say, well, try batch 1, let's see how it works. If that doesn't work, try batch 2, try batch 3, and if that doesn't work, we'll give your money back. So and no one's stopping it. So why are we not stopping it? There's almost no legislation to stop this kind of things being done in fertility clinics and in research all over the U.S. It's like a Wild West, and essentially it's also a competition among countries. You know, there's Japan and China and the UK, and they're farther ahead in their research. So it's almost like a prideful competition to see who can create the first such and such, who can create. So we need to really take this and do something about it, because if not, we're going to see that these edits will be introduced into the human germline, and we have no idea what kind of impact that's going to have on the human genome for all of us.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Arina. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.